Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this chem safety webinar on what not to do when, what to do when workplace exposure standards are lowered. My name is Sam McGee, a senior occupational hygiene consultant at Chem Safety, and I'll be your presenter today. So, what we're going to cover in this webinar, just briefly, is what are workplace exposure standards? Why are they different from country to country? We've had a lot of questions about that recently. And what should you do when they change? We'll also go through some examples, and there'll be some time for some questions at the end. Some questions have already been emailed through to us, and we'll go through them at the end as well. But feel free to ask questions in the Q&A tab that I'll answer once we finish the presentation. Our details will also be in a follow-up email, which will be sent to you by our sales manager, Chris Cowie. That will include a link to the recording of today's session and some online resources as well. So let's get started. What are workplace exposure standards? They've got different names in different countries, but in New Zealand, we call them the workplace exposure standards. And there are three main types: the workplace exposure standards, the biological exposure indices, and the PES prescribed exposure standards. We'll go through them in a bit more detail in the following slides. So, workplace exposure standards. These are the most common ones that you'll encounter in New Zealand, and we call them the WES for short. So the WES are guideline values set by WorkSafe New Zealand. They are concentrations either in parts per million, parts per billion, or milligrams per meter cubed, which should mean that most workers can be repeatedly exposed to this concentration without coming to harm. Doesn't mean all workers, each one of us has their own individual susceptibility, but most people should be safe at these levels for the 8-hour working day, 40-hour working week, average career length. The WES are designed to be used as guidelines for health risk monitoring by trained people. There are a lot of factors that can affect the workplace exposure standards, so synergistic effects, ototoxins, sensitizers, that we're not going to go over in detail here. But it means that, standard health and safety rep or even health and safety advisor shouldn't be using these standards without expert advice. It takes many years of training to be able to handle all the weird quirks that these sort of guidelines can throw up. So the WES have three main types that you'll see in the book. We've got the time-weighted average, and this is simply an average exposure over an 8-hour working shift. It's designed to cover continuous or frequent intermittent exposures throughout the workday. The most common type you'll find in the WES is the WES book is the TWA standards. There are around 600 of them versus much smaller amounts of the other types that we'll see shortly. These are designed to protect and reduce the likelihood of chronic health effects, your long-term ones. The next type of exposure standard we've got is the short-term exposure limit, or the STEL. And these are 15-minute exposure periods, a max of 4 of them per shift, and at least an hour gap between those exposure events. And they're to protect from acute effects. So something like the intoxication from ethanol vapor is a substance that has a short-term exposure limit. And the final one, and the least common one you'll come across in the WES book, is the ceiling limit. And this is a limit that's not safe to exceed and is to protect from acute effects. An example of this would be chemical asphyxiation from carbon monoxide. So there is a ceiling limit for carbon monoxide in our WES book. Now these values are published by WorkSafe roughly every year, but it varies from time to time. So up to edition 14. And these just get put on the website, and they have a searchable part of their website too, so you don't have to go through the whole book. You can just type in the name or CAS number of the substance that you are concerned with. Then we've got biological exposure indices. So they're also part of the WES book. The BEIs are guidance values set by WorkSafe, and these are a concentration of a substance or breakdown product found in blood, urine, or exhaled air. This should mean that most workers should not experience adverse health effects from that particular substance. There is a significantly lower amount of BEIs available compared to the workplace exposure standards. We're talking somewhere between 35 and 40 BEIs, whereas over 600 workplace exposure standards. The BEI sample should be taken by an occupational nurse or other nurse or occupational physician, and care needs to be taken in regards to the timings of these samples, as they are quite specific. Some of them will be at the end of shift, some have to be at the start of the shift or the end of the week. Some at any time, but it needs that expert guidance because taking it at the wrong time will give you the wrong sort of information. It's worth noting that this will include all exposure to the worker. The workplace exposure standards we talked about before are mainly for the inhaled exposure, the exposure we get from breathing in the substances, whereas this will also account for dermal exposure and exposure that might be out of the workplace because it's in the body. So if a welder is doing welding during the weekend just as part of their hobbies, they're going to still be exposed to that sort of stuff, and it might come up in the BEIs where it wouldn't come up in the WES standards. Other things such as hobbies or diet, if you might have a high heavy metal exposure because you've got a lot of seafood eaten. So there are other things that can cover this sort of side, which means extra care and interpretation is needed when using BEI data. The final one you might come across is a prescribed exposure standard, or PEERS. Now, this isn't a major thing to worry about as there's only one of them at this stage in New Zealand. And the PEERS prescribed exposure standard can either be a WES or BEI, but it must be complied with. It's not a guidance value like the previous ones. A PEERS can be set in one of three ways, either a safe work instrument or the HASNO Act of 1996, or as a control under Section 77 or 77A, or an exposure limit under Section 77B, or a group standard approved issued under Section 96B. There is only one PEERS at the moment. It is for ethylene dinitrile, which is used as a timber fumigant. So it's not something that most people will have to worry about. Another thing to note about these WERs is they can have some text beside the numbers that will change what those numbers mean or how they're meant to be used. So we call these notations. There is a lot of them in the book, but some key ones you might need to be aware of. The R notation for respirable dust. That means it's not all the dust, what we call the inhalable dust, which most standards are. It's the respirable fraction of it, which is that can get deep into the lungs. So that means a special sampling method is required to monitor for those. You might see OTO notation, which means ototoxin. This means that this substance can affect your hearing or damage your hearing as well, not just loud noise, and they can work synergistically with the loud noise. We've got a few different sensitizing ones. We've got dermal sensitizers, respiratory sensitizers, and just general sensitizers. So these are substances that, with repeated contact, means even very small amounts can set a person off well below what is the current standard. So it's something we need to be aware of. We've got skin absorption. This means that the substance can be absorbed through the skin easily, in addition to being inhaled. And then the little symbol you see there, if you see that next to your exposure standard, it means it's an interim WES. This effectively means WorkSafe don't believe this value is currently protective, and they have plans to lower it in the near to medium term. So if you see that symbol next to your workplace exposure standard, you should really be looking at trying to reduce your exposure further because a reduction is going to happen. But we'll go over that later on in this presentation. So why are WES different between countries? We've received a lot of feedback from clients recently, a bit confused when they get information from overseas that's different to that provided in New Zealand. And their main thing they come to us with is, well, shouldn't the hazards be the same worldwide? Welding firm in Australia isn't any different to welding firm in New Zealand. So we're going to go over a bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So how do we set up our workplace exposure standards in New Zealand? This is the process on the WorkSafe website, simplified a little bit, but WorkSafe reviews any scientific data, such as the hazardous properties of the substance, whether it's a carcinogen, is it corrosive, etc. The pharmacokinetics, which is how the substance works in a body, so things like how it's absorbed, how it gets spread throughout the body, does the body do anything in the metabolism to change it up, and how does the body eliminate it, or does it eliminate the substance from the body? Then internal and external specialists will review the data before it goes through a quality assurance process and then put out for public consultation. So during the consultation period, they provide some documents of their thinking, their reasoning, what they want to put the WES to, and that goes out to industry and health and safety groups, any groups in New Zealand to put submissions in, and why or how they should change or not change the exposure standard. After that consultation, WorkSafe will review it, make a decision, and then the new WES is set and published on the WorkSafe website. So why are the WES different in different countries? There are many factors that go into exposure standards, and they're not the same from one country to another. So it takes a lot of time to review and update these exposure standards. It's not just simply clicking a few buttons. So some countries may have reviewed that standard recently, and it's quite up to date with the modern data, modern epidemiological data, whereas others can have standards that haven't been reviewed in the last 10, 20, 30 years. So just because they haven't reviewed it yet means it could be a much more lenient standard than what may be of a newer standard. Some countries have standards that are legal requirements and others have them as guidelines. Often you'll find that the legal requirement ones are a little higher, they're easier to meet, whereas the guidelines, because they don't have to meet them, will be a little bit lower and more difficult to meet. Who is setting the standard can also depend on how harshly the standard may be set. So is it an industry body? Is it a health and safety group? Is it a government department? All those have different priorities when they're setting their standards. Some countries have different levels of industry input. Some will ignore it completely and just purely do a health-based guideline. Others will take into factors what industry wants, how feasible it may be. Things like engineering practicality, the economic impact of lowering the standard. Is it going to cut production, kill an industry, all those sort of things? Others will consider analytical limits, whereas others won't. In New Zealand, they tend to do a health-based one, so it's primarily based on what will protect the workers' health, and none of those other factors weigh as heavily. So we have frequently got questions about welding fume and why that's different, mainly because in Australia, they've recently lowered their workplace exposure standard from 5 milligrams per metre cubed to 1 milligram per metre cubed. In New Zealand, we don't anymore have a specific exposure standard for welding fume. We consider what's been said that we should consider the individual components of the welding fume, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So it wasn't that long ago that many of these countries had the same 5 milligrams per metre cubed standard across the board. As you can see, some of them here, like Australia and Germany, have adopted a lower standard. New Zealand and the UK have decided it's not worth having a standard for it. It's better to measure other things. Whereas USA and Canada currently don't have one, but it's on their list for review in the near future, so they may choose to implement one at that point. So New Zealand WorkSafe have said that they don't believe the welding fume standard would protect workers, and that because there are many components of welding fumes or metal fumes that have much lower exposure standards, and that we should be aiming to protect the workers from these. So here's a list of some of the common metal components that you'll see in welding fume, and the fumes that's been simplified a bit, but you can see there's quite a range of standards here. So we've got quite high ones like iron, basically the same as what welding fume used to be, of 5 milligrams per metre cubed, compared to hexavalent chromium, which is the chrome 6 that you may see down the bottom there, at 0.00002 milligrams per metre cubed, and that's just the respirable fraction. We get hexavalent chrome when we weld stainless steel. It's not present as in greater quantities in mild steel, etc., but stainless is definitely a key area where we'll find hexavalent chrome. You can see here just an example of why you need to be trained to interpret exposure standards. We've got a lot of different factors here. So we've got inhalable and respirable. So inhalable is the total dust that we breathe in, whereas respirable is those that only get into our lower respiratory system, basically where the oxygen exchange happens. And you'll find that those that are respirable are often a much lower standard than those that are an inhalable standard. We also have subcomponents for like chrome, for example. We've got general chrome, and then we've got hexavalent chrome, which, because we know hexavalent chrome has more health effects, which is an oxidation state of chromium, so we've got a specific lower standard for that. So, what a lot of you have probably come here for, what should you do when the workplace exposure standards change? Now, it can vary from company to company, organisation to organisation, but I've put through some general steps we can follow, and we'll work through some examples at the end of how we could do this. So the first step is gather the information. What are the new workplace exposure standards? So you can go to WorkSafe, but in their health-related work newsletter that they put out, they'll link when the new WES is out there. Is there any additional or new notations added to that workplace exposure standard? Is it suddenly considered a sensitizer? Does it have a respiratory So a respirable notation, these things will change how we need to monitor for. We should see how we use these substances, or if we even use these substances that have the new exposure standards. Many sites can have, larger sites, hundreds, thousands of substances they use. It's hard to keep track of all of them. If we've got any previous exposure monitoring reports or health monitoring results, we should look at those, see how we are comparing. And we should also get an understanding of what our current control measures are that we're currently using and what their level of effectiveness is. Things like PPE, which is the least effective control. If you're using a half-face respirator or your N95 style mask, they've got inferior max of up to 10 times protection. But if you are now going to be 20, 30 times the exposure standard, that's not going to be a suitable control measure anymore. You're going to have to upgrade your PPE along with those additional controls. Second step after we've gathered the information is pretty simple. We can review the information. So using that hazard hierarchy controls is always a great way to do that, and we'll go through that in the case study. But your elimination, isolation, engineering controls, administration controls, PPE, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. We can compare the results, previous results with the new exposure standard, where we're under the limit and now we're above, easily done, and figure out what our unknowns are. Have things changed significantly? Is our data up to date, or does it need to be recaptured? All these sort of things. And obviously the next step after this is going to be coming up with an action plan. And you can engage professionals like us as hygienists to come and help you at all these steps, because if it's not your bread and butter everyday task, it can be quite overwhelming with all the jargon notations, and we'll try and simplify it for you. The third step is that action plan. So do we need more monitoring or other information? Do we know the specs of our engineering ventilation system, or do we need to get someone in to investigate that for us? We can implement some short-term control options while we figure out how big our problem is. So adding some additional PPE, changing a workflow or production pattern to minimize the use of that product and increase the use of a substitute product. All these sort of things can be done very quickly and relatively cheaply. We can put in plans for longer term controls that may have a lot of capital required, such as increasing our extraction or putting a new extraction, or changing our product formation to not include that hazardous substance anymore and include a less hazardous thing. But all that takes time. We should also set in some plans to review after a few months to see how effective our controls are, and this is a continuous process. We should also look ahead, because some substances in that WES book may have been flagged for future reviews, and standards don't typically get easier to meet. They often get a lot more stringent. So it's key to pay a look at those interim WES and see how many of those substances you have, because when you're planning your long-term controls, you might find that something will handle both substance A and substance B, and it will cost a lot less to do it together than in two separate stages. So these are some of the recent changes in the 2024 edition of the Workplace Exposure Standards. In terms of stuff we come across when we go to site, these are the more common ones. There was a lot more than this, and for the full list of changes, I suggest you go to the Workplace Exposure Standard website. So I've simplified this a bit, but we've got aluminium, used to have 10 or 5 milligrams per meter cubed standards, depending on the source of the aluminium, and now it's all been lowered to 1 milligram. So either the new standard is either a 10th or 5th of the previous standards. So that's quite a reduction. Ethanol was at 1,000 parts per million, and now it's down to 200 parts per million. So once again, that standard's decreased by a fifth. Fluorine was at 1, now it's at 0.1, so a 10th of that standard. We're really lowering and making it a lot more stringent to meet the workplace exposure standards with these new guidelines. Selenium went from 0.1 milligrams, so it wasn't much to begin with, and now it's 0.02, so a fifth of the previous standard. The one you might have heard a lot of in the news recently, crystalline silica, or respirable crystalline silica, particularly in Australia, they've banned the engineered stone bench tops because of this in certain states. Is halved. It's gone from 0.05 milligrams per meter cubed, which isn't much at all, to 0.025 milligrams per meter cubed. So I'll work through a case study, engineered stone bench tops, due to that recent news in Australia and maybe eventually over here. So you're a company and you manufacture granite and engineered stone bench tops. Since the respirable crystalline silica exposure standard has been an industry focus, you've invested in controls and you have exposure monitoring done a couple of years ago, so you think you're reasonably up to date with where things are at. A worker has informed you that the WES for silica has changed and it's lowered. So step one, we have to gather the information. We find out that the new workplace exposure standard is half of the old one. It was 0.05 and now it's 0.025 milligrams per meter cubed. We also note that there was no new notations added. That means there's no other factors we have to worry too much about at this stage. We look at our internal processes and we realise that the engineered stone has decreased slightly in use from 2 years ago, but it still makes up over 60% of our production. We know that granite has less respirable crystalline silica in it than the engineered stone, so we try to steer customers towards that, but the engineered stone is still proving popular, so it's not something we can just eliminate at this stage. So while we're still gathering information, we check our control measures that we've put in place, and they haven't changed recently, and they passed their inspection 4 months ago, so we got an engineer in to assess that our ventilation system was still working, and it was all given the tick. And we have some previous exposure monitoring data. And this is sort of getting into stage 2 now. We're going to review that data and compare it to the old WES. So we look at our operators. We've got 3 cutting operators and 2 installers. We can see that in the results column that the cutting operators have much higher exposure than the installers. But they're all significantly above the WES time-weighted average for their day. So we're talking, 5,200% down to 1,200%. So all of them were all significantly over the exposure, but we have other controls like PPE, etc., to help mitigate that. We know that the new exposure standard is half of it, and pretty simple maths means that we're now twice our old exposure levels. So our new exposure levels, rather than ranging from 1,200% to 5,200%, they're now from 2,400 to 10,400% of the exposure standard. That can be a bit hard to wrap your head around, so I did change the next slide as well. This one here is basically the new side. How many times higher are you than the exposure standard? So we're now 24 to 104 times higher. Now I've boldened those above red, above 50, so 68, 96, and 104, as once we get above 50 times the exposure standard, many types of common respiratory protection aren't going to be sufficient and won't provide the suitable level of protection. So that is something we have to be concerned about. Whereas previously, our highest one was only just over 50%, whereas the average of those 3 was probably just below. So we're able to deal with certain types of respiratory protection, whereas now we probably won't. And this is why you need to get people in who understand occupational hygiene, as there's a lot of nuances here that we can't go into the detail of that I'd like to. But so continuing with the reviewing of information, we can use the hierarchy of controls to come up with some ideas of how we can reduce our exposure, knowing that it is now much more of an issue now than it previously was. Elimination isn't going to be a suitable option for us. That's 60% of our production. Our business will cease to exist. We just can't eliminate it. Substitute, we've been trying to push people towards granite, but it isn't working. We can continue to push that way, but it's going to be a middling control at best for us. So we look at the bottom 3 steps, the engineering controls, the admin controls, and the PPE, and we realize that's where our focus and effort is going to have to be. So new results are double the old results. Old data was used when we took, that exposure monitoring was 2 years ago, and we have improved our processes. So perhaps that data isn't quite relevant to our new system. So we'll get some new monitoring, and that hopefully will show some lower levels, and that we're not exceeding it to the same effect. So we come up with an action plan, and we're going to undertake some new exposure monitoring. Let's get some new fresh data, see what the actual levels are in our current situation. We're going to refresh training to staff on the risks of the silica exposure, so they know what symptoms to look out for, what controls they should be putting in place, and how they should go about eliminating their exposure as much as possible. We're going to enforce the use of PAPA, which is positive air-powered respirators, for all tasks instead of some tasks. We did have it as a high-risk task only, but now with that increased exposure compared to the new data out there, we want to protect our workers. So in the short term, we are going to make sure PAPA is used for all tasks. We're going to put in our budget a new slurry management system to help the dried slurry that comes when we're cutting this engineered stone. So we're putting in the capital planning now to make sure we can do that as soon as we can. And we're going to review in 6 and 12 months where we're at, what to do, so we can keep continuing this process. Now, the new data might show that they're going better or worse. It's hard to say, but yeah, this is a pretty good example of what we should do when we lower our exposure standard. So, a little bit about chem safety here. So we do a wide range of things before we move to the questions. We've got chemical consultancy. We cover asbestos, hazardous substance, so location certification, certified handler, audits of your compliance, asbestos surveys, etc. We do occupational hygiene, fit testing, training, all those sort of things. So just feel free to get in touch with us and we can help you there. And time for some questions. Now, I know one person here has already submitted some questions by email yesterday, so I'm going to go through some of those, and feel free to start typing in the Q&A tab as well. So the first question I've got here is, what sort of notification do WorkSafe supply, or are they under any obligation to notify industry of any significant changes to the workplace exposure standards or the BEIs? As far as I'm aware, they put everything out on their website. They may contact specific industries. I'm not 100% sure on that. But when the WES are up for review, they put consultation documents out, and I suggest going to the WorkSafe website, and they've got a subscribe to emails function where you can tick what industries and what sort of areas you're associated with, and they'll send you emails, and that will include things like the consultation documents when they come out. So that's something I do, and that's one of the ways I get my information from WorkSafe. As far as I'm aware, they're not obliged to specifically go out and talk to every business about that, but they may talk to industry groups. I can't speak for them in that regard. The next question was, if WorkSafe are not going to notify anyone and something goes wrong, where does the responsibility lie? It's probably more of a question for WorkSafe or government in general. I guess the WES are, apart from the one peers at the moment, are guidelines as opposed to legal requirements, but you are legally required to protect your workers as much as reasonably practical to do so. So that would probably be the argument that if it was practical to do it, irrespective of what the number said, then you should be doing it. Next question. These changes have a large effect on training and testing material for engineering trades. For example, there's no limit to work to in relation to safe limits for welding fume. Instead, we have to go through the individual elements to work out their toxicity level and then try to decide on a safe level. That is what WorkSafe has come up to. Welding fume is sort of a catch-all. It wasn't for any specific. And it was a good indicator, but I guess the analysis methods have got to the point where we can relatively easily and cheaply monitor for the specific metals without too much difficulty. So that's why I think WorkSafe have changed. But once again, you'd have to probably talk to WorkSafe specifically. In regards to the training, it's probably something to take up with the training bodies, the apprentice programs, etc. It's all about the control measures more than what the number says. So about using the on-tool extraction, using the powered air respirators, clean work sites, all that sort of things will help with the build-up of the metal exposure. But I agree, it's something that a lot of the apprentice programs probably do need to do a bit more on. This question says, I'm not adverse to seeking professional help, but it would be nice to have a choice. With that choice being taken away, cottage industry is born. I guess that's more of a statement, but it is getting more and more difficult to measure that and protect the workers' health and safety without that specialised knowledge. And I do understand that there are a lot of SMEs out there that struggle with this. I know ACC have done some programs to help with a couple of specific industries, and it might be something you could get your industry body to get in touch with ACC to try and produce like a guidebook for your industry, because they do understand the issues with the small to medium enterprises and engaging the range of consultants and experts that they need to know to keep all their workers safe. Why can't each metallic welding formula be analysed and the data promulgated for each workshop to sort out where they stand, e.g. structural welding, boat building and stock here? There are some bigger epidemiological sort of studies in America In New Zealand, none of that stuff has really happened, probably due to funding issues and just the scope and scale. If It's also a bit difficult because the data borders on health data, so sharing it from one person to another industry, it's got to be anonymized. I know there are works plans or planning in place to create an exposure database in New Zealand, but that's still not something that exists at this stage. Other questions do we have? This one says, are the WES changes proposed or are they set in place? All the WES changes, when they're put through for consultation, are a proposal. Basically, at that stage, it goes out. WorkSafe have a pretty strong opinion, like they've already decided what they'd like to change it to, and you've got to convince them otherwise that whether that is appropriate or not. Other things that they might do is delay the implementation of that standard and have a phasing in period. I've seen that with some substances before. But WorkSafe will want to see credible information in regards to the health effects, typically, and to help them change their mind, something they may have missed, etc., like that. They're not set in stone, but more often than not, they will end up being what is the proposed version will be implemented at a future date. Just a couple more minutes for any further questions. This one here. What is the legal requirement for health surveillance and biological testing? So there's a legal requirement to protect workers. In terms of health surveillance, people have a right to the medical tests that are done on them. They can choose to refuse treatment, etc., because it sort of now starts to blend over to some healthcare acts. So you can choose not to have a blood test, but there may be consequences, or you're going to have to assume that they have high levels if they chose not to do a blood test. So to protect your workers, you don't have to do biological surveillance monitoring, but it's definitely deemed best practice. But you've also got to get your workers buy-in there. When it gets to the health monitoring side, that's starting to get a bit out of my scope and more towards an occupational health nurse, and they're probably slightly better be able to answer that question for you. Will those carrying out monitoring be aligning monitoring with the new levels? And you're referring to silica dust in that case? Yes, I would hope that anyone in New Zealand who is undertaking monitoring is comparing, always checking to see what the most recent levels are and not just relying on an old book they have on their desk. So we definitely, as soon as we're aware of the new exposure standards, will compare all reports to that and notify clients of recent jobs where we think that might be an issue, that the old standards have changed. And I believe most members that you'll find on the NZOHS or HAZANS register would be doing the same. Any chance for last questions coming through? Right then, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this webinar. If you have questions you want to do afterwards, feel free to send us an email. This will be put up on YouTube later on, and some information will be sent out as well. Yes, enjoy the rest of your day.